The crystal chandelier of the Yun family banquet hall hung beneath the three-story vaulted ceiling, its light shattering across the floor. Chopin's nocturne flowed from the pianist's fingertips, spilling over the glass edges of the champagne tower and circulating among the guests' evening gowns and diamond cufflinks. Clara stood at the doorway, wearing a black long dress without any jewelry. She was thinner than 2 years ago. The lines of her collarbones appeared sharp in the light, like a blade sheathed in its scabbard. No one came forward to greet her. The woman in the blue dress was Mia. The man with the gold-rimmed glasses was Ryan. She recognized them both. 2 years ago, Mia was the investment director she had promoted from the ground up, and Ryan was the project manager she had personally mentored. At this moment they saw her too, but their gazes seemed separated by a layer of mist, politely and precisely avoiding her. Clara is back. Mia walked over holding a glass of champagne, her smile appropriate. 2 years recuperating in New Zealand, you look well. Clara didn't respond. Her gaze swept past Mia's slightly stiffened lips and landed on the 2-meter-tall amethyst geode in the center of the banquet hall. That was what she had bought at auction for $7.8 million 2 years ago. The Yun family's heirloom, now silently refracting scattered light. By the way, did you know? Adam is here today too. Mia raised her voice a little as if announcing some good news. He brought Miss Nina with him. They're practically inseparable now. Someone chimed in with a laugh. Clara's fingertips curled at the side of her skirt, then relaxed. 2 winters ago, she stood in the kitchen for 4 hours, learning to make sweet and sour ribs. Oil splattered onto the back of her hand, blistering the skin, but she didn't make a sound. She served the dish and waited until dawn. He never came back. Later, she saw in a post from a mutual friend that on that day he was in Sanya, watching the sea with a girl in a white dress. She turned off her phone and sat on the sofa until daybreak, without calling, without asking. The door opened. Adam walked in, his hand resting on a young girl's waist. The girl wore a white evening gown, her long hair draped over her shoulders. Her features were 50% like Clara's at 25, but softer, her smile carrying a hint of shy sweetness. The crowd fell silent for a moment, then erupted into even livelier small talk. Some stepped forward to toast, others praised Nina's dress, and still others eagerly ushered the way. Adam saw her. He walked over, his expression indifferent, as if looking at a distant relative passing by chance. You're back. Yeah. How is your health? It's okay. Nina stood beside him, her gaze sweeping over her face, then lowered her head and said softly, Hello, sister. Adam frowned slightly. No need to call me sister. You are not like her. Nina looked up at him, her eyes bright, bit her lip and smiled, saying nothing more. Clara watched them. The meaning of that not like her was, Nina was legitimate, acknowledged, and standing by his side. And what was she? She was an existence arranged to recuperate, blurred away by time. Clara. Dylan walked over holding a wine glass, his smile gentle but his eyes cold. It's been 2 years and you're still as quiet as ever. This half-brother was 3 years younger than her. 2 years ago, when she went abroad for medical treatment, the management of the Yun family naturally transitioned into his hands. It was supposed to be temporary, but that temporary period lasted 2 years, and his loyalists had already secured their positions on the board. Do you have any plans for this trip back? Dylan asked, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. Just looking around. Take a look. Dylan let out a laugh, his voice neither too loud nor too soft, but loud enough for everyone around to hear. Sis, there are some things I didn't want to say, but since you're back, the Yun family has changed a lot over the past 2 years. With the current structure and business lines, I'm afraid a sick person wouldn't be able to keep up. The surroundings fell silent for a moment. Mia lowered her head and took a sip of champagne, while Ryan adjusted his glasses. Adam, standing to the side, finally spoke. He looked at Clara, his tone flat. Clara, you really have been gone for too long. The circle isn't what it was when you left. Clara looked at him. 2 years ago, she would make hangover soup when Adam came home from socializing in the early hours, say it didn't matter when he forgot their anniversary, and put his phone back without a word after seeing Nina's photo on it. She thought that was love. Later, lying on a hospital bed in New Zealand, Really sick, not pretending. She finally realized. It was just a one-woman show. The corners of her mouth curled slightly. It was not a smile of grievance nor a smile forced through pain. It was just a faint movement of her lips, like a glimmer of light skimming over a blade. Her gaze swept over Adam, Nina, Dylan, Mia, Ryan, and those who had once accepted her help but now watched her in silence. You think, her voice was soft, yet crystal clear in the quieting banquet hall, that going abroad for 2 years has made me soft? She turned and walked toward that amethyst geode. The geode stood in the most prominent spot of the banquet hall, a 2-meter-tall purple crystal breathing a deep luster under the lights. 7 figures bought by Clara, the face of the Yun family, serving as a silent backdrop at every banquet. Clara picked up an unopened bottle of champagne from a nearby table. Someone noticed her movement and looked over in confusion. Mia opened her mouth as if to say something but didn't make it in time. The champagne bottle was swung up and smashed down heavily. Bang! The geode cracked down the middle, purple shards exploding in all directions like a miniature firework. Someone screamed, people recoiled, the champagne tower was knocked over, and glassware clattered across the floor. Nina screamed and ducked behind Adam, her face pale. Dylan's wine glass froze in midair. His lips slightly parted. Mia and Ryan exchanged a glance, neither looking pleased. Adam strode over, his face livid. Are you crazy? Do you know how much this thing is worth? You. 7.8 million. Clara's voice was calm. She stood where she was, motionless. Her palm had been cut by a flying shard, and blood was dripping down through her fingers, yet she acted as if she felt nothing. 2 years ago I took that shot. My property. I'll smash it if I want. Adam's mouth opened but no words came out. Clara bent down, picked up a piece of amethyst from the debris, and held it in her palm. The shard was sharp, piercing a little deeper. Blood seeped out. She lowered her head to look at it, as if observing something that had nothing to do with her. She remembered the Yun family's annual meeting 2 years ago. In the same spot, wearing a red gown, she had watched Adam and Nina receive blessings in the center of the crowd. Someone had approached and exclaimed, "Clara, you are truly generous." She had smiled and said it didn't matter, her nails digging into her palm, the pain in that very same spot. Now, purple shattered light was scattered across the ground, as if the silent judgment from 2 years ago had finally been carried out. Clara, Adam lowered his voice, carrying a threat. You've caused enough trouble today. We'll talk about it when we get back. Go back. Clara raised her head, looking at him, her gaze devoid of any warmth. Adam, let's break off our engagement. The banquet hall seemed as if the mute button had been pressed. Then came a wave of suppressed whispering. What are you talking about? Adam reached out impatiently to grab her wrist. Clara took a step back and dodged him. She took out a craft paper envelope from her handbag. It was unsealed, and inside was a stack of photos and a few pages of printed transaction records. 2 years ago I received an anonymous email, she said, her voice soft but distinct in the quiet hall. That was the first domino. The photos made me start looking into it. The transaction records made me dig deeper. And the sentence on the last page made me decide to play out this charade. She handed over the envelope. Adam took it, pulled out the contents and looked through them one by one. The photos showed him and Nina together at the entrances of different hotels. There was a copy of the property purchase contract for the house bought for Nina, and there were bank transaction records showing transfers from an account in his name to Nina's account, 30 million in total, split into 12 installments, each with a clear date and note. Adam's face turned from livid to pale. His hands began to tremble. When did you? Starting from the night I received the email. Clara looked at him. I spent 2 years investigating every sum of money, every account, and every affiliated company. You embezzled funds from the Yun Group, transferred them to Nina, and then laundered them back into the Gu family businesses controlled by you and your father through the small companies under her name. I thought you were just having an affair, but I didn't expect you to be so stupid with the books too. She turned her gaze to Dylan. Dylan's expression had already changed. He subconsciously took half a step back. You helped him cook the books, helped him move the money around, and helped him launder the Yun family's funds into assets under Nina's name. Clara's voice was flat. You think I didn't know? You know perfectly well what you put in that calming soup you brought me 2 years ago. If my doctor in New Zealand hadn't detected the drug residue, I might not even be able to stand today. I have already handed the evidence over to the police. Dylan's lips moved, but no sound came out. He looked at Adam. Adam didn't look at him, just staring at the photo in his hand as if nailed to the spot. Clara. Adam finally raised his head, his voice hoarse. Are you going to destroy me? You destroyed yourself. Clara placed the piece of amethyst in her hand on the nearby table, blood leaving a dark red trail on the surface. Adam, we are done. It ended the moment you chose to go to Sonia 2 years ago. She turned and walked toward the entrance of the banquet hall. The people around her automatically cleared a path. No one dared to look at her, and no one dared to make a sound. At the entrance, a man in a dark gray suit stepped aside. Owen. He held a glass of champagne but hadn't taken a sip, his gaze fixed on her the entire time. Seeing the blood on her palm, his brow twitched almost imperceptibly. As Clara passed him, she heard him say something in a low voice, so soft it was nearly drowned out by the commotion behind her. That hand needs to be treated. She didn't stop, continuing to walk forward. Behind her came Adam's out-of-control voice. Clara, you think you've won. What does what you found amount to? Mr. Grant will. The sound was cut off by the banquet hall doors. Clara walked out of the banquet hall and continued down the corridor until the night breeze from the garden hit her face, and only then did she stop. Her palm was still bleeding. She glanced down at it but didn't tend to the wound, simply letting her hand hang so the blood dripped slowly into the soil of the flower bed. Footsteps approached from behind and stopped 3 paces away. I have medicine and gauze. It was Owen's voice. He took a small first aid kit from his pocket, something he carried with him, though it seemed out of place in this setting. In the car, if you're willing to step over. Clara turned around and looked at him. Dark gray suit, immaculately tailored, with a matte silver tie clip and no ostentatious logos. Owen, the head of the Lu group, known in Beijing circles for being low-key. She wasn't close to him, but 2 years ago, on the day before she went abroad, she had received a text message from an unknown number with just 2 words. Take care. Later she checked, and that number belonged to Owen's personal mobile phone. Mr. Owen, she said. You've been watching? Half of it, Owen said. I went out for the second half, so I didn't see you smash the geode. A bit of a pity. Clara froze for a moment, then let out a laugh, very soft but a genuine laugh. What's there to pity? 7.8 million just smashed like that. Owen's tone was flat. You don't see that every day. Clara didn't speak. After a few seconds of silence she said, Why did you send that text 2 years ago? Owen looked at her, opened the first aid kit, and picked up an alcohol swab with tweezers. 2 years ago, I went to New Zealand to discuss a project and found out you were there too. I had someone send over a letter of intent, hoping to meet you. You refused. Later I heard you were sick. I thought about it for a while, and still sent those 2 words. His wound dressing technique was deft, disinfecting, applying medicine and wrapping gauze, his movements clean and precise. It wasn't out of sympathy. I just felt that someone like you shouldn't just vanish without a sound. The gauze was wrapped. Clara withdrew her hand and flexed her fingers. Grant will make a move. I know. Owen packed up the first aid kit. The Gu family has 3 production lines in Southeast Asia. The Yun family has no foundation there. I do, Clara said. 2 years ago, when I went abroad, it wasn't to recuperate. Owen looked at her, waiting for her to continue. When I was in New Zealand, I registered a trading company under the identity of Clara. I set up a 3-layer firewall in the holding structure, so no one can trace it back to me. For the past 2 years, 30% of the Gu family's supply chain in Southeast Asia has passed through my hands. They don't know that. I offered prices 5 points lower than the market rate. Grant thought he was getting a bargain, but in reality, I was building the distribution channels for him. The moment I withdraw those 5 points, his costs will immediately rise, and his downstream clients will run. Owen fell silent for a few seconds, then suddenly smiled. So you started laying the groundwork 2 years ago. When I was lying in my hospital bed, aside from recovering, there was nothing else I could do. 3 months. Owen said. How long do you need? The Gu family scale is right there. If I cut off his supply chain, he can still get loans from the bank. But if I can simultaneously cut off his credit lines in Southeast Asia, I can do that, Owen said. The Liu family has a joint venture bank in Southeast Asia, and I have veto power. I can call a halt to the loans on Grant's lines. Clara looked at him. And the conditions? No conditions. Owen started the car. Just think of it as making up for the second half of the show you missed. The car drove out of the parking lot, the city lights of the night flowing past the window. Clara leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. She thought back to the hospital room in New Zealand 2 years ago, the anonymous email on her phone screen, photos of Adam and Nina, transfer records, and a line attached at the end. Grant knows your illness is fake. She had stared at that line for a long time, then took a screenshot and saved it without replying, without asking for an explanation. Grant knew she was feigning illness to go abroad, but he didn't expose her because he had his own calculations regarding the Yoon family. He wanted to remove Clara from the center of power so that Dylan and Adam could secure their positions, and so the Gu family could extend its reach into the Yoon family's business. He assumed that a woman abandoned by both love and family would be unable to cause much of a stir even if she knew the truth. He did not know that from the night she received that email, she had never truly been ill again. The next morning, Clara appeared at the headquarters of the Yoon Group. She did not notify anyone in advance, but she knew that the news from last night's banquet had already spread like wildfire. On the way up in the elevator to the top floor, she sent a group email to the 7 members of the board of directors, with an attachment containing a 32-page report, 12 related party transaction contracts signed by Dylan during his tenure as acting manager, each suspected of involving conflict of interest transfers, with the most serious one involving the Gu Group. The administrative assistant was taken aback when he saw her step out of the elevator. Before he could announce her arrival, she had already pushed open the door to the chairman's office. Dylan was sitting in a large leather chair, talking on the phone. Hearing the door, he looked up, and his smile froze the instant he saw Clara. "Sister." He hung up the phone and stood up. "How did you?" "Dylan, you're fired." Clara placed the printed board resolution on the table. "The interim board meeting starts in 15 minutes, and all 7 directors are online. Will you attend? Or will you wait for my vote?" Dylan's face alternated between red and pale. He picked up the resolution, scanned it, and suddenly smiled. "Sister, do you think the directors will listen to you? Who earned them their dividends for the past 2 years?" "You earned them for them?" Clara interrupted him. "Of the 12 contracts you signed, 6 are loss-making, and the other 6 show paper profits but have unclear capital flows. Over the past 2 years, the Yoon Group's annual report shows a 12% increase in net profit. But if the profits from these related party transactions are excluded, it is actually negative growth. I have already sent the data to every director. They saw the full version before last night. Today is just a formality for the voting procedure." Dylan's smile vanished completely. 15 minutes later, the interim board meeting was convened. On the video screen, the faces of the 7 directors appeared one after another. Some had shifty eyes, some were visibly relieved, and some stared expressionlessly at the screen. The atmosphere was as heavy as the sea before a storm. Clara stood at the head of the conference table, the projector scrolling through the 32-page report. She made no lengthy speech, simply laying out the facts. Losses, capital flows, the relationship between related parties, and the Gu Group. The final page showed records of fund transfers between accounts under Dylan's name and Adam's account, along with a lab report, the drug residue test results for the bowl of calming soup from 2 years ago, accompanied by a police case filing receipt. "According to Article 23 of the company bylaws," Clara said, "if the chairman engages in conduct that causes serious harm to the company's interests, the board of directors may immediately initiate removal proceedings. I propose that Mr. Dylan be relieved of all duties with immediate effect, and that an external audit firm be engaged to conduct a comprehensive review of the financial transactions from the past 2 years. Those in favor, please raise your hands." The 7 directors remained silent for 5 seconds. Then the first raised a hand, followed by the second, the third, until all 7 hands were up. Dylan stood there, his face deathly pale. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but in the end said nothing. He turned around, pushed open the door, and walked out. Clara didn't look at him. That afternoon, Mia and Ryan received termination notices one after the other. The content was identical. Serious violation of professional ethics, and using their position to assist related parties in transferring company interests. The signatory was the newly appointed executive director, Clara. Clara sat in her office, with the early autumn sunshine streaming through the window. 2 years ago, when she walked out of here, her suitcase contained only a few changes of clothes and a medical record. Now she sat back here with 3 copies of termination letters and a research report on the GU Group's Southeast Asian supply chain on her desk. The phone rang. The screen displayed a strange number, but she recognized the origin of that string of digits. Adam's private mobile phone. She hung up. The phone rang again. She hung up again. The 3rd time she answered. Clara. Adam's voice exploded from the receiver, hoarse, anxious, with a hint of uncontrollable fear. What have you done? GU Corporation stock price dropped 7% today. Do you know that? I know. Clara's voice was flat. There's still 93% left to fall, no rush. You think you can beat Grant? Adam lowered his voice with a hint of threat. Mr. Grant has been rooted in the Beijing circle for over 20 years, and you with a 2-year setup. He's been rooted there for over 20 years, Clara interrupted him. Simply because no one has ever planted explosives beneath his roots. Adam, did you call to beg me to spare the GU family, or to beg me to spare you? Silence fell on the other end of the line. After a long while, Adam's voice came back much lower. Clara, can we talk? You know what kind of person I am. I just made a momentary lapse in judgment, Nina. I know exactly what kind of person you are, Clara said. You made a momentary lapse in judgment. A lapse that lasted 2 years, lost 30 million, and nearly poisoned me to death. Adam, don't call me again. She hung up. Then she added a number to her blacklist. The sunlight outside the window shifted slightly, landing on the corner of the desk and illuminating the first page of the Southeast Asian Supply Chain Report. GU Group's 3 production lines in Vietnam and Indonesia, the supplier lists, and the procurement prices. Behind every data point lay the foreshadowing Clara had planted over the past 2 years using that trading company. She turned to the last page, picked up a pen, and drew a circle next to the divestment plan column. Over the following month, GU Group's stock price was as if it had been sliced at the ankles, quietly beginning to slide. It fell only 2% in the first week, which industry insiders called normal fluctuation. By the second week, it had dropped to 5%. And people started discussing why GU Group's suppliers in Southeast Asia were suddenly raising prices across the board. In the 3rd week, the drop widened to 12%, and the media began drafting articles on the GU Group's supply chain crisis. Grant could sit still no longer. He had been in closed-door meetings in his office for 3 days straight and had sent 4 teams to Vietnam and Indonesia, yet the feedback was exactly the same. The suppliers claimed they had switched to a cheaper upstream channel and would not renew their original contracts upon expiration. When asked about the background of that upstream channel, everyone shook their heads, saying it was a trading company registered in New Zealand with no identifiable legal representative. Grant slammed the investigation results on the table, his face as dark as the sky before a storm. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. Dylan. It rang for a long time, but no one answered. He then dialed Adam. Adam picked up, his voice sounding weak. Mr. Grant. You still have the nerve to call me Mr. Grant? Grant's voice was suppressed, but every word landed like a heavy blow. Clara spent 2 years setting things up in Southeast Asia. You didn't know? Adam fell silent for a few seconds. Mr. Grant, I really didn't know. She was in New Zealand for those 2 years. I thought she was really recuperating from an illness. What do you think? You think a woman, once betrayed and driven out of her home, will just meekly accept her fate? Grant sneered. Adam, you haven't just provoked a woman. You've set off a time bomb that's been buried for 2 years. He hung up the phone, picked up the investigation report again, and his gaze landed on the line that read, New Zealand Registered Trading Company. He remembered seeing a sentence in an anonymous letter 2 years ago. Clara's illness is fake. He had thought it was a good piece of leverage to save for later use. But he had never imagined that a woman with a fake illness would spend 2 years in a foreign land weaving a web. He dialed a number to call Owen. Mr. Owen. 3 of Gu's credit lines in Southeast Asia were suspended this month. Grant's voice was polite but probing. I heard Lou has a joint venture bank over there. Mr. Grant. Owen's voice came through the receiver, as flat as if he were discussing the weather. The credit approval standards of the joint venture bank are set by the board of directors. I only have one vote and do not have the authority to stop it unilaterally. But if you ask for my personal opinion, your company's supply chain in Southeast Asia has experienced significant fluctuations recently, so it is reasonable for the bank to be cautious. Grant gripped his phone, his knuckles turning white. Mr. Owen, he said, you and Clara. I am not well acquainted with Miss Clara. Owen interrupted him. I only met her once at a banquet the night before last and exchanged a few words. What do you mean? I said her hand needs to be treated, Owen said. She ignored me. Is there anything else, Mr. Grant? The call ended. Grant stared at the dark screen, the veins on the back of his hand throbbing. That night, Owen sat in his study and sent a message to Clara. Grant came to see me today. He suspects I'm involved with you, but he doesn't have any proof. Clara replied with a single Owen typed another line. When do we proceed with step 3? A few seconds later the phone lit up. Next week. Week 7. Gu Corporation's stock price had fallen by 34%. 2 of the 3 production lines in Southeast Asia had been shut down, and the remaining one was operating at less than 60% capacity. People in the Beijing circle began using the term Gu crisis, no longer avoiding it. After Clara took over the Yun Group, its stock rose by 21%. At the board meeting, she proposed a plan to rebuild the Southeast Asia division, utilizing the overseas channels that Dylan had previously left idle, and reached out to the suppliers that Clara Trading Company had been nurturing for 2 years. Re-signing the contracts took only 2 weeks, as both sides were already familiar enough that no mocha was needed. Adam appeared at the entrance of the Yun building on a rainy afternoon. He did not have an appointment, and the receptionist stopped him, so he stood in the lobby waiting. From 2 o'clock in the afternoon until 5, the rain did not stop, and neither did he leave. Finally, someone from the administration department could not stand it anymore and called Clara's extension. Miss Clara, Mr. Adam has been waiting downstairs for 3 hours. He says he wants to see you. Clara looked up from her documents. Let him come up. When Adam came in, Clara almost did not recognize him. He had lost over 10 pounds, his suit hanging loosely on his shoulders, his eyes deeply sunken, and a layer of unshaven stubble on his chin. The image of him 2 years ago at the banquet, wearing a bespoke suit with cufflinks gleaming, seemed separated by a distant layer of mist. Clara, he began, his voice hoarse. I called you 47 times and you didn't answer a single one. I blocked you, Clara said. Adam stood by the desk, his hands hanging at his sides, clenching and then unclenching. Suddenly, he dropped to his knees knocking against the marble floor with a dull thud. Clara! He looked up at her, his eyes rimmed with red. I was wrong. I truly know I was wrong. I've already cut ties with Nina. I'll never contact her again. I can also testify for you regarding Dylan. I was there when he brought Grant in, and I can tell you everything I know. Can you please? Can't what? Clara's voice was flat, as if she were watching a play that had ended long ago. Can you give me another chance? Adam's voice trembled. We've known each other for 6 years, been engaged for 3, you can't just. Can't just what? Clara stood up from her chair, walked around the desk and stopped in front of him. She didn't ask him to stand. She simply looked down at him, her gaze as indifferent as if seen through frosted glass. Adam, I cooked for you for 4 months, yet you never came home for a single meal. When you were hospitalized with a stomach hemorrhage, I kept watch for 3 nights, and the first thing you said when you woke up was to ask if Nina had called. When you embezzled money from the Yun family to buy her a house, did you ever think about our 3-year engagement? Adam's lips trembled, unable to speak. Does kneeling once make up for it? Clara said. Then let me list everything you've done to me. Would kneeling for a day be enough? 10 days. Tears rolled from Adam's eyes and hit the ground, spreading into a small dark stain. He reached out to grab the hem of her skirt, but Clara took a step back. Stand up, she said. Don't embarrass yourself here. Adam remained kneeling. Clara looked at him for a few seconds, turned and walked back behind her desk, pressing the intercom. "Security, come up." Adam finally stood up unsteadily. He looked at her, as if waiting for a final word. Clara did not look up. She had already reopened the documents on her desk. "Adam," she said, her voice soft as if talking to herself, "if you really loved me, today wouldn't have happened." Adam left. The office door closed and Clara put down her pen, looking out at the gray sky. She remembered 2 years ago in New Zealand, one late night when she had insomnia and stood on the balcony watching the starry sky of the southern hemisphere. On her phone was saved Adam's last message from 3 months ago. "Rest well and recover, don't overthink it." She stared at that message for a long time then set the phone aside and continued studying the star chart. She needed to find out exactly how many lines the Gu family had laid out in Southeast Asia. That night she made a decision. She would no longer wait for him to turn back, nor would she hate him. She simply wanted to take back what was hers, and then move forward. The office door was knocked on again. This time the secretary brought in a delivery, thin, from Owen. Inside was a note with a single line written on it. "The third line in Vietnam stopped today. 6 weeks left." No signature, no letterhead. Clara folded the note and placed it in the drawer. There was also an older piece of paper in the drawer, a handwritten plan from 2 years ago when she first arrived in New Zealand. From investigate Adam's finances to build Southeast Asian channels, to reclaim the Yun Group. The items were listed chronologically, with a checkbox drawn after each one. Now only the last 2 boxes remained unchecked. She picked up a pen and placed a tick in the second to last box. Next to complete rupture of Gu Group's supply chain. Week 11. The Gu Group announced the suspension of all operations in Southeast Asia, and the withdrawal of funds to protect the domestic market. The day after the news was released, Gu Group's shares fell another 9%, and its market capitalization had evaporated by nearly half compared to 3 months prior. Financial media headlines shifted from Gu Group crisis to Gu Group dilemma. Grant was asked at the last board meeting to step down as chairman, not removed but to voluntarily resign, leaving him a shred of dignity. Grant remained silent in the conference room for a long time, then stood up, did not sign the resolution, simply pushed the documents back, turned around and walked out. The next day he sent a message to Clara through an intermediary. "The Gu family can withdraw from Southeast Asia, and the Yun family will take over. Gu will never touch a single cent of the Yun family's assets again." Clara sent back a message. 2 years ago when you helped Dylan transfer the Yun family's assets, did you ever think about today? The intermediary relayed the message to Grant, and Grant did not reply. By the 10th week, Adam had been completely purged from the Gu family's hierarchy. The Gu family issued a brief internal statement, saying that Adam had damaged family interests through personal conduct, and would no longer participate in any family affairs, effective immediately. No one knew exactly what was discussed, but that same night he moved out of the Gu family mansion and into a rented apartment. In the 9th week, Nina tried to contact Adam, only to find that all her contact information had been blocked. She also went to the entrance of the Yun Group building to intercept Clara once, wearing a white dress, standing in the lobby crying, claiming she was innocent and that Adam had deceived her. Security asked her to leave, but she refused. Eventually, she was escorted out by 2 female administrators, half persuading and half dragging her. Upon learning of this, Clara said only 3 words. "Ignore it." On Friday night of the 11th week, Owen asked Clara out for a meal. It wasn't at any high-end restaurant, but a small Cantonese eatery next to his company, tucked away in an alley with an unassuming storefront, but the soup was delicious. 2 people sat at a small table in the corner, with a pot of slow-cooked soup and 2 small side dishes. Clara drank her soup with her left hand. The wound on her right palm had just healed, leaving a faint white scar. "You didn't take what Grant offered?" Owen asked. "I did," Clara said. "But that doesn't mean I forgive him. It's just that the Yun family really needs those channels in Southeast Asia. Dragging it out won't do me any good." Owen nodded and picked up a piece of green vegetable with his chopsticks. "What are you planning to do next?" "The Yun Group's Southeast Asia division needs to be rebuilt, and I plan to go over there myself to oversee things for 6 months," Clara said. The people over there may have signed the contracts, but trust hasn't been fully established yet. Owen put down his chopsticks and looked at her. How long will you be gone? About 6 months. Why? Nothing. Owen picked up his soup bowl and took a sip. The Lu group also has a new project to discuss over there. Clara glanced at him. The private room fell silent for a few seconds. Outside the window, a cat walked along the top of a wall in the alley. Its shadow stretched long by the streetlight. Owen, Clara suddenly spoke up. When you sent that text message 2 years ago, did you simply think I shouldn't just disappear without a word? Owen thought about it seriously for a few seconds. That's what I thought at the time. It was only later, when I found out you had registered a company over there, that I started to feel you might not have just gone there to recuperate. So you've been keeping an eye on me these past 2 years? I'm watching, Owen said. But I'm not interfering. Because that's your business. Clara lowered her head, looking at the remaining half bowl of soup. I don't really trust right now, she said. Not you specifically, but everyone. Owen nodded, as if he had expected her to say that. Then don't trust it for now. In 6 months, when you're back from Southeast Asia, if you still want to eat this soup, I'll ask you out again. Clara looked up at him. His expression was quite ordinary. It didn't look like a confession, nor like a concession, but rather like stating a very simple arrangement. There was still time, no need to rush. When they walked out of the small restaurant after dinner, the night breeze was a bit cool. Owen took off his jacket and handed it to her. She took it and draped it over her shoulders without saying thank you. The two of them walked side by side out of the alley. The street lamp pulled their shadows together, then apart, then together again. The newsstand on the street corner was still lit, with the latest issue of a finance magazine displayed in the most prominent spot. The cover featured a photo of Clara, white shirt, black trousers, hair tied back, a calm expression, and her gaze looking toward a distance beyond the lens. The headline consisted of just one line. The new head of the Yun group, Clara. Clara glanced over but didn't stop walking and walked right past. Owen walked by her side, not stopping either. At the banquet 3 months ago, the shattered crystal light lay scattered across the ground, the amethysts blown to pieces, and no one came forward to greet her. 3 months later, she walked in the autumn night breeze, with someone by her side and a plan sheet in her hand with every box checked. The road ahead is still long, but at least the direction is clear, and her footing is steady. She looked up and glanced at the city lights shining from the end of the alley. Then she continued walking forward.